If you don't know who he is now, after tonight, you will. Patrick Mulcahey. Mark Frazier. And Graylin Thornton. And I'm going to tell you something. I love all four of them to death. So they're yours now.
Can we use the microphone that we have before?
I think we just need to project.
Yeah, I think we need to talk. Can everybody hear us?
Yes? You can
Yes?
okay.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. We'll just speak up.
So what we're going to do is we're going to sort of go down the line and sort of give you for those who don't know who the hell we are, who we are, kind of where we came from, and we'll all do that. We may have a conversation with each other. We will have a conversation with you. You can ask questions of us. We can dialogue with each other. It will kind of be free form, and we'll see where it goes. So I was joking. I was born in a manger. No. I came out in 1972 into kink, and I came out about a year before as gay. I walked into my first leather bar when I was underage. I could always grow facial hair, and back then they didn't really card people. So I was hanging out with leathermen when I was 16, 17. I was working in a gay men's quasi-Levi leather bar by the time I was 18, underage, at the time in Illinois. So I came directly out into leather and directly out into kink right out of the gate. My second experience was in a gay men's bathhouse. And I walked in, again, I was underage, I didn't know what I was doing, and I encountered a man who was limping in front of me, and I looked down, and there was, I discovered, Crisco on his foot. And so my very first real kink experience was coming into a bathhouse and encountering a man who had just put his foot up somebody's butt. So that was kind of like opening the doors really wide, really fast, and I entrenched myself in the gay men's leather scene pretty quickly. So I've been doing this for a long time. I was a player. I was a bartender in those kinds of bars. I was a frequenter of some of the sleaziest places that have ever existed on the face of the earth. Both in Chicago, in New York, and then LA. It was really LA in 1980 when I kind of came out into the mainstream organized scene. Before that, I was a rogue wolf, and we used to call them a lone wolf. They were not joiners, that was me. And I ended up at a party in 1980 in LA. I was playing with a guy that I didn't know, somebody I had met at the party. And I turned around, and there was about 30 people watching the scene, and they said to me, "How did you learn to do that?" And I said, "I just watched people and did it." And back then we didn't have classes, back then we didn't have books, back then we didn't have anything except learn from someone else and watch and explore and try it out.
Stones and chisels?
Pardon?
Stones and chisels?
Stones and chisels, yes. Yes. We had papyrus and... so that was how I came out. So I was a player, and I was apparently a major player pretty early before I realized I was. And those same people then turned around and said, "Would you teach us what you just did and come to a class?" And that was a club called Avatar in Los Angeles in 1980. And that kind of began my public part of the scene. But I've been doing this stuff a long time. So, and so long that when I was 8 years old, my next door neighbor would come over once a week for 3 years. We'd go down into my basement, I would pull his pants down, I would spank him and put his pants back up and send him on his way. And we did that for 3 years, once a week. I was 8, he was 7. So I came out of the gate doing this. The other thing that, and we'll move on to the next guys, but I came out of the gate directly as a top and a dom. One guy tried to top me, and it didn't work very well. And so it thrust me directly into total top dom space for a couple of decades. And I'm a full-fledged switch now, but I belie the sort of truth that you have to start at the bottom. I was pretty fucking good right out of the gate as a top. And so for those that think you have to start at the bottom or always have to experience something as a bottom, you do not. You have to have empathy, your eyes wide open, and want whatever it is you see. And there's a lot of ways to get into this scene. It isn't just what someone tells you, work your way up to the bottom, or you have to start as a slave, or a boy, or a whatever. So I will leave it at that. Patrick.
Thank you. I have to start kind of early to talk about how I found leather finally. I mean, like when I was 12, I was drawing my own leather porn, like these big, naked, hairy guys tied up. And I draw them with great detail. I have no artistic talent whatsoever. But I draw them in pencil. I erase the parts where if the pec were too big, I'd round it out, and I'd get all excited and do what excited 12-year-olds do, and then rip the thing into 1,000 pieces. I didn't know that I didn't know why it excited me. I didn't know where that idea came from, but it was just there.
Excuse me, Patrick, can you speak up, please?
Oh, sorry, yes, thank you. Then when I was still in my teens, I told the wrong person that I thought I was gay and wound up committed to a mental hospital, to an adolescent psychiatric ward, which is, we won't dwell on here, but it was like it's part of me. I can't wish it undone. I can't be happy about it, but it was, I learned a lot that way. I also learned that I could not sign myself out until I turned 21, so it was more than 2 years. And I did sign myself out, and they warned me that they thought I was a danger to other people, and so I hitchhiked out of town. I went to Provincetown, Massachusetts. I didn't know very much about being gay. I knew that Provincetown had gay people, and I knew that being gay required special clothes. That was about all that I knew. I stuck my thumb out, got a ride from another gay guy going to Provincetown, and several blowjobs along the way as well. And in Provincetown, I got a job, and I'm walking home from my job, my waiter job at the Lobster Pot one night, and this guy is following along behind me going, please, please, will you come back to my hotel with me? You're so hot. I wasn't hot. I was this tall, string bean, skinny, white guy. And finally he said, oh, please, please, I want to tie you up. I thought, what? This is something people actually do, like in those drawings that I made when I was 12. I mean, this actually happens at the same time as sex. Count me in. Now, I did think, maybe there was some risk involved in going back to a room with a guy I didn't know from London, Ontario, who was going to tie me up, but then he was Canadian. How dangerous could he be? So I had two immediate reactions to his tying me up. One was, wow, this is really hot. The second one was, he's doing it all wrong. So I took my turn. We did things like take turns in those days. And that was a wonderful experience. I spent all weekend with this non-dangerous Canadian guy in his hotel room. Then he left. It's like, where do I look for that again? I was a small town guy. I was completely divorced from any kind of big mainstream gay culture, let alone a leather community. But there was this one guy. He actually was somebody I worked with named Bill. And he was tall and arrogant and tough. And we weren't close or anything. But I was sitting in a restaurant one morning where he was having breakfast, and a bunch of sweater queens were at another table, all looking, as sweater queens do now, very hot and well groomed and taken care of. And Bill was kind of staring at them. And I kind of watched this thing unfold. And the sweater queens had one too many mimosas and said, "What's your problem? What are you looking at?" And Bill, in his leather jacket, sat there at the table, smoothed his hair back in the best James Dean style, and said, "I'm from San Francisco, and I'm in the habit of looking at people until I'm done." I thought, San Francisco, where I eventually moved and lived for 33 years. But before that, leather was hard to find. There was the guy who wanted to tie you up in a hotel room, but there was, if you were outside of a metropolitan area, it was not really available. Then, except for the classified ads and Drummer, but
Back pages?
yeah. So,
Okay.
that was enough of me, huh?
Okay. Well, unlike, the previous two, I did not realize I was gay till I was 23 years old. I was, I love women. I love women now. I think they're hot. I think they're gorgeous. But, I got my Red Wings back when I was 16 years old. I thought I found my place in the world. But then, when I was 23, I went to my first gay bar. Well, after I convinced the door person I wasn't there to beat anybody up, I walked in, got me a Jack on the Rocks, something very strong, had a second one, and the bartender goes, "Come downstairs to the office with me." Went downstairs to the office with him. He gave me a blowjob, and I have found what I'm missing. So, needless to say, I decided I was a gay man then. The following week, in the same bar, I'll walk in, see two very hot men in leather jackets with covers on their head, and a couple days later, I became their slave. So, this is all within, a month. Me going from, having Red Wings
From
to...
first blowjob to slave?
Exactly.
See how easy it is?
And, after living in that relationship for a little less than a year, they realized that, number one, I was too much to handle, which I can imagine. Or number two, they wanted to be in a more homogenized relationship, which did not include me. So I went along my merry way, and, I was in Tulsa, Oklahoma at the time. Just think, Tulsa, Oklahoma, nothing going on. They did have a gay rodeo association, so I became involved in the gay rodeo associations.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. I remember that.
And was president of the Gay Rodeo Association. Very involved in the community. There was a woman who was also my secretary in the Rodeo Association. And she and I became very, very, very close. And as I was growing out of Oklahoma and decided I wanted to explore my sexuality somewhere else, this woman said to me, and I will never forget this because I've applied it to every aspect of my life. She goes, "Mark, leave, go out and find yourself, but the one piece of advice I'll give you, always make a difference in whatever you do." That person was Vi Johnson.
Oh, shit.
Vi was, my strength then. She's my strength now. I don't always agree with her, but you never you don't always agree with Mama Vi, but you know, we love her anyway. And so from there, you know, I moved to Dallas, Texas, opened nightclubs, businesses, became further involved in the community at deeper levels, and that's where I'm at today. I left Dallas in August, moved to Palm Springs for another chapter in my life. Now Graylin,
Okay.
my sister.
See, don't believe that. My journey was a little different because I grew up in the Bay Area. And growing up, I thought the rest of the world was like the Bay Area. So I never had to come out or anything because where we lived, you could be gay, you could be transgender, you could be anything you wanted because it was the Bay Area. So it took me a while to understand that the rest of the world wasn't like this. I think my leather journey started when I was 12. My parents took me to see a movie called Mandingo. Oh boy. And I saw Ken Norton, you know, there being chained and beat and sold, and I understood exactly what was going on, and I wanted to be him. Because I saw a big, beautiful black man on the stage, and he was so good looking and so wanted that people were willing to pay for him. And I thought, that's where I want to go. So as I'm growing, the second movie that I kind of snuck in to see was The Story of O. So I watched that and I thought, I want to be her. So growing up, and I'm now starting to explore leather because it's easy for me to find. I can go to San Francisco and find anything I wanted. So I stumbled into a bathhouse called Animals. And it was one of the seedier bathhouses, and I figured I could get into there because they weren't checking IDs, they didn't know, they didn't care. So I go into Animals, and I'm making my way downstairs. And the guy at the door, they had a separate door downstairs, said, you can't come in here. And I was like, why not? And he says, because you won't understand. So I talked myself down into the basement, and I understood everything that was going on in that room. And I wanted to participate in everything going on in that room. So I found a sir and said, you know, I want to be your boy, I want to be your slave, I want you to own me. Pretty much in those words. And he said, you have no idea what you're talking about. Go away and learn and come back to me. And he still lives in San Jose today. So to get to him, I went out and started having experiences. And for me, finding leather and finding people to play with was always very easy. I wandered into a leather store called Mr. S, and I heard there was a guy there named Alan Selby who I should meet. So I walked in, and Daddy Alan comes down the stairs and says, well, hello, dear. And I say, I'm looking for Alan Selby. He says, I'm Alan Selby. So he takes me around, and he started showing me around the bars. And being a man of color, I realized I was quite rare in San Francisco. What was different, though, was in the leather community, people cared about the play. It was all about the play. It was all about the fun. It really wasn't about the color of my skin. In the non-leather gay community, racism was rampant. Going into the Castro, there were bars that I couldn't get into, like Badlands. And, well, there's that other one, the Sun something. Midnight Sun. Didn't allow people of color into their bar. We were carded for 2 pieces of ID. So looking at that and looking at everything that I had learned, I knew that I was going to be a leather man. And so I set out learning just so I could get back to the man in San Jose, which never happened, by the way. But along the way, I started to learn, and after a while, I decided I'd run for a title. So I ran for Mr. Santa Clara Leather, and I came first runner-up. And the judges said to me, this wasn't your contest. This isn't the one you should be in. You should be in drummer. Went to drummer in Northern California. I won that one. And then I went to the international contest, and I won that one. And then I found out I was the only man of color to ever win that title. So then the rest of my journey was not only being visible to people who are not people of color, gotta be phrasing that correctly, but to show people of color that it's okay to be kinky, that it's okay to be in a dungeon. Yeah. When I started out, people of color would say to me, that's a white thing. So I spent my year showing other people of color that this is okay. Not only is it okay, but this is an experience that we should all have. I'm gonna pass it on after that.
One of the things that's kind of interesting is the four of us actually are extremely close friends. And we all have, well, yeah, we're all extremely close friends. Let's put it that way. But we all have ties. I mean, I was one of his judges at the drummer contest that year. And we go back to the era of Tony DeBlas and playing in the same spaces with Tony. And Patrick and I, we don't go back as far, pardon me, but we go back very, very far as well. And one of the things that I think is kind of magical is that, and I don't mean it's just the gay men scene, because it's not, it's the scene generally, but back then it's the scene we knew, is that we felt like family kind of from the get-go. We really, honestly felt like family from the beginning. I've known Mark for 30 plus years. And can I tell the dungeon story?
Sure, go ahead.
So, I mean, Mark and I are playing in a dungeon, and over here is Tony DeBlas playing with Bob Goldfarb, and over here is Brian Dawson. You may or may not know these names. Over here is Midori playing with her boyfriend at the time, Michael. And and we looked around and went, fuck, this is pretty cool. And it was kind of a magical moment when we all kind of bonded in this really familial way, in a way that at that time was kind of unique, because you didn't bond in erotic ways in many places except those few places that we found. So, and we have many friends that I think are in that category of long-term familial gay male leather kink family, but this is pretty magical for us. That's really what I was going to say.
I look out in the audience, and I connect with one person in the audience. The women have always been a really important lifeline for me in the community. One of the very first play parties I ever went to was an all-women's play party in San Francisco. There was myself, and there was another gentleman from San Francisco who was also invited. I was invited by this woman. I was going to stay with her. She had this huge play party. Sharon was there. Love you to death. And I seen women fisting with knives. I'm going, bah!
Doesn't that hurt?
And Frank, the other guy, we look at each other and we're going to the Castro. So we left, came back, the party was wrapping up, and these women were all my protectors also. And so as it was winding down, I come in and they're all camped out on the floor. So I just crawl up in the middle of them and I sleep, knowing that, if anything happened, they're there to take care of me. So I get overprotective of the women's community. If you ever hear any of my keynotes or everything, I always point that out. The women are such a big part of me. And I can't always explain that, but that's one of the reasons. They've always been there for me. They've always been there for the gay men's community. And also often, they're not given that respect that they're due. And that's unfortunate. You know, so when I look out in the audience, and you'll see me around at events, I tell people I don't shake hands. I'm a hugger. But when I hug a woman, there's something extra special because there's a connection there. So that's another part of my life that I've actually embraced. You know, the women's community is very strong. I love them to death. So, and this woman back here is just, you know, she is a part of my heart.
No, Mark made me think of something. When I was growing up in the leather community, I was in my fairly early 20s, and I was coming out of the gate really fast, and I wanted to try everything. And one of the lessons that I learned early was it really didn't matter who was doing what. I wanted to play with the best person who did that thing. So I sought people out and would walk up and say, "Would you please single tell me? I hear you're the best person to do it," and they would do it. Luckily for me, when I was growing up, I had people looking out for me. I never, ever, ever worried about being with someone who might harm me or being with someone who didn't know what they were doing. I had people like, I mentioned Alan Selby before. There was Alan Selby, Philip Turner, all these people and these names that you've heard about. When I was young, they were there with me, making sure that I did everything right and that I was always safe. I never worried about a thing. So I was always protected in the earlier days.
I think my experience is different in that my first leather guys that I found were not in a metropolitan area. It was, I moved to New Orleans for a job. Oh no, I was following love at the time.
Same thing.
No. I'll move for love. I'd never move for a job again. But I did not know where to find this thing that I had experienced in Provincetown that I talked about until I met this guy. I think his name was Tom. I feel terrible that I don't remember his name for sure. But after a couple heavy rough sex things with him, where he had me like take his belt and tie his hands behind him, so I knew I was onto something. Then I got introduced to this little circle that he had of guys, and it was not really a bike club. There were a couple bikers. Some of the guys were Vietnam vets. We were all pretty like dysfunctional misfits who really liked poppers. We didn't have anything. I don't think they even used the word leather men. I don't think, and they ever, in New Orleans you don't wear a lot of leather. And we didn't have anything as formal as play parties. We called it the weekend at times. And we had one bar that we went to, the Golden Lantern up on Rampart Street, and we shared it. It was the same night that we were there was the night that, it was rare in New Orleans because it was mixed black and white bar. That just didn't happen very often in New Orleans. But it was like the odds and ends bar where like drag queens and leather people shared the bar the same night. So it was a little bit of like nostalgia for me having the drag queen up here before. Anyway. So I liked that you were dealing with everybody. We had a couple of bitch women who hung around with the group who were also bikers, and we had great sex, uncomplicated, not very sophisticated toys. We didn't even call them toys. Nobody gave classes, or if you wanted to learn how to do something, somebody put it in your hand and showed you what to do. And you just kind of figured it out the same way that you figured out how to tie your shoes and wipe your ass and brush your teeth and things like that. I mean, it was fell in that category of physical functions that you learn how to do. Then later, when I did move for a job to Connecticut, right outside New York City, when I did come in contact with a major metropolitan leather community in New York, I couldn't adjust. I would go to places like the mine shaft or the baths, and it would look like the hottest porn video you could ever imagine. And I just felt like there was an invisible shield between me and all those people. The hierarchy of it, the I don't know, I guess we could call it protocol, the ways of behaving just seemed so alien to me. And I think the first big community I could ever really feel part of was in San Francisco when I got there, because it was a bit more relaxed. There were a lot of people from the more regimented era of leather who were gone for reasons that we don't need to even get into. And there was a lot less formality.
For those that sort of worship at the altar of, and I'm going to use two words that I almost never use. You know what they are, right?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, and it's old guard. They say I was there, and it looks nothing like what they tell me it was that was in front of me and that I was doing. We fucked our brains out. We had a good time. Everyone got along. He mentions the women's community. The women that sort of got involved with us just kind of organically did, and it worked.
Right.
And it just worked.
And don't you hate hearing guys say, "Oh, well, in the old days there were no women around"? That's just not.
That's
true.
not true. We always had women in the bars. It was just they felt welcome and familial, and they were part of our family, and it just kind of worked, and we didn't even think twice about it. Now, when it came to playing, I remember, speaking of the mine shaft, there was one woman allowed in the mine shaft ever. It was one of the most notorious gay men, sleazy, BDSM, kink, twisted sex clubs that's ever existed. It was in New York.
Yeah, but about 10 women say they were that woman.
I know, they do. But there was one woman, and she would go, and she would always say, "I don't go beyond this door." And then I remember one day...
Was that the door before the bathtub, or?
Yeah, it was and a whole bunch of us took her down into the dungeon, and I remember this sort of very special moment, and she said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." And it was sort of the first time that a woman had been introduced into a men's space, but she completely respected it. She said, "I go into this space, you invite me into this space, this is magical, thank you." And she would always be up in the bar space, but she would only be taken down into the dungeon area if a group of men took her down, and that's what they did. So but there were always women that were part of the scene. The other thing is that you're gonna hear a lot of lore, especially if you're newcomers. A lot of you I see are seasoned faces, but if you're gonna hear a lot of lore about this is the way it was, and we trained ourselves into the scene, and you had a mentor who always sort of, no, that didn't happen that often. Most of us learned kind of by the seat of our pants. You went into clubs, you played with people, you just fucked and played, and it all kind of worked out. And you met people in a bar, or you met people through a classified ad with a coded number, and you sent an envelope with a coded number to some address, and they then sent it to someone else. So it was a very different kind of world.
It took like 6 weeks.
It took 6 weeks. Forever. Now we have apps.
You had to really want it.
So
You forgot who it was.
the gist of all that is that every time you hear the way something was, it very well may not have been. And take every bit of old guard lore you hear and the way it used to be, or back in the day, to use your word, your phrase, and take it all with a grain of salt, because most of the time it really wasn't that way. It was very organic and it just kind of happened.
Wasn't it? I mean, it seems to me that it was not really, for me, it was not really before. I know it was happening before, but around 2003, it seemed like everybody I knew was teaching classes or taking classes. This was such an alien thing to me. I thought, classes? Do I need a class? Am I doing it wrong? I've only been doing this for 30 years, but I better take a class, or I better teach a class. Wow, that was a huge change, I think, in the community.
And the other thing is that when
the advent of classes.
The heavier stuff, the women taught us all the heavier shit.
Exactly.
I walked into a play party, you
blood.
might have been there, and this woman was pierced all over with strings suspended, and then the top was cutting the needles out one by one.
Oh, the top?
Yeah.
That was Sharon.
Sharon, was that you? Was it you? I thought so. And
That's her special.
And I went, oh my fucking God. And now remember, gay men didn't play to blood very often back then. No. It was the women. I keep pointing at you two, I'm sorry. I know that. But the women were the ones who were drawing blood and doing knife play and doing piercing. And gay men weren't doing that very much. We were fisting, we were fucking, we were beating each other, we were doing stuff like that. But it was the women who taught us how to do the heavier stuff. Thank you. So they taught the men.
They did.
And because it was mostly lesbians and gay men that hung out at the time, with a few others mixed in, but that's mostly, it was us hanging out. And they taught us how to do the heavier stuff. So anyway, thank you.
You know,
You know, back in the early 90s, there was an event called Living in Leather.
yeah, sure.
Some of the hottest fucking classes I had ever gone to.
That's where I met you.
Yeah, it was. And you know, one of the scenes which I'll always remember, and it actually got me over the phobia of blood, was I walked into a class. These two women were playing. One was on a table, and she had IVs stuck in her with drip hoses, and the blood was squirting out of the drip hoses onto her head and running down her face. And all I wanted to do was just fucking lick the blood, you know. And so,
Wait, IVs?
yeah, just drip IVs. They were just, you know, and the blood was just dripping.
I hope it was the slow dog.
That's enough. We got the picture.
But you know, but at that time, so many gay men were afraid of blood.
Even pre-HIV, we were afraid of blood.
Right. But seeing something like that was just, and maybe it was because, you know, my Red Wings experience, whatever, but there's always been this attraction to blood for me. So I can't explain it, but you know, the scene was just fucking hot. And to this day, when people say, what scene do you remember the most? That's always one that would stick out in my head. The blood.
What room were you in, Mark?
You what?
What room were you in?
Yeah, we'll talk.
You know, Ray said
I
something.
think it's 217.
No,
216.
that's racist. You know, Ray said something that I wanted to come back to real quickly. When we talk about the rules and the rules that weren't there or maybe were there, what I remember at the Eagle, because remember I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, on Sundays you could walk into the Eagle and everyone was dressed the same, because back then we didn't have all the colors and the pipings and nothing was real fancy. So most men had a pair of leather pants which you only wore on very formal occasions. Some chaps, some jeans, a vest, and a jacket. And that was pretty much it. Some people had a harness, but you only wore your harness really when you were going to a play party, because that made, you know, you could hang people up and do things with the harnesses. So we didn't have a whole lot of leather. So everyone sort of looked the same. And then if you take into account the boys all had on the same sort of collars and everything, so we were sort of uniform. But I think what people thought was this was the uniform for leather people. It wasn't. It's all we had. You know, we didn't have all the fancy stuff they have today. And so now today, when we see, I'm just gonna speak for myself now, when I see boys in the half harnesses and the color and the jock strap, it's kind of hard for me to wrap my head around, because we didn't have that.
The person that I would say would be my mentor would be Tony DeBlas, because by simply associating with him and watching him play and sitting down and talking to him and picking his brain, and he was the first person to ever top me in a BDSM sense. I don't know if you knew that, but he was the very first person to ever top me, even back when I really wasn't bottoming much. He was such a classy man, and we owe so much to him. We owe, obviously, the leather pride flag to him. We owe, to some extent, the proliferation of education. Maybe we've sometimes gone a little bit too far in that realm, but he was one of the first people to actually codify and teach and instruct and write how-to material about BDSM, and he was passionate. The other thing that he was really passionate about was making sure that men and women of all orientations understood each other, mixed, respected each other, learned from each other, and that sometimes meant you had your own space too. But he was really on the vanguard. I'm gonna call it the pansexualization of the scene. I know that has another meaning today, but back then that's kind of what we called it. And he was really on the cutting edge of that, and he was also one of the really the brain trusts around living in leather and making sure that men and women of all orientations came together for really the first time in a play and educational and social setting at Living in Leather. So I worship the man. I miss him terribly. So that's mine.
I don't think I had I think in New Orleans, I had mostly other guys who were figuring it out with me. I don't think they were like mentors in that we learned together, but it was not the same kind of relationship that I had when I had a mentor in San Francisco. That was much later, when I was in Journeyman 3, which is a leather training program that lasted 18 months. It doesn't exist anymore, but there is a sequel to it. And this was a guy that I don't really see very eye to eye with about anything. But that didn't really matter. He wanted to help me be me. And he sort of guided me in my reading and in my discussion, and I would reject certain things, and he'd say, but what about, and I would see there was value where I had seen none. And that's a really important way to open somebody's eyes, is to help them see the shiny importance of something that they previously thought was crap, you know? That's one of life's big chores, is to do that for yourself. But he did that. He started me on that path. And then I gotta say, even though it's a fairly recent relationship, it's not as, Guy Baldwin was like a mentor to me. He's a friend now, but when I was struggling to figure out my personal structure of MS, what being master and slave would be like with my wonderful slave/husband here. Guy was really, first, slavecraft was really important to me, and then when I met Guy, we clicked immediately and traveled around to events together and talked all through the night, and that was a really important growth experience for me. Now I want to slap him upside the head most days, but no, not most days. But we have a different kind of relationship now than we did then.
You know, I think my mentor, if I was going to have one, would be Tony DeBlas also. Tony was the person who, I have printed off emails from Tony back in the AOL days, dial-up, dot matrix printer, emails I printed off from communications that I've had with him. And Tony was probably the most phenomenal player in the world. Tactile, he could read your body, he could read your mind. You know, he knew exactly where to push you and how to push you and how to get you there. And he and I mean, when I became president of the National Leather Association, Tony was the first person I asked to sit on my board as my advisor. And Tony and I continued that relationship up until the time he passed away. I remember when he came to Dallas and I filmed the Out of the Darkness video. Did an interview with Tony, and you know, there was a play party going on later that day, and Tony goes, "Let's go over to the play party." He goes, "I want to tell you something." So as we're driving down the road, he grabs me by the hand. He goes, "Mark, I'm not going to be around much longer." And to hear that from a mentor, I mean, I had pulled my truck over and just start boo-hooing. Because Tony was this person who I thought would be around forever. We would never lose him. And you know, he's so much a part of the leather community, the SM play community, you know, that he's ingrained in our history now. So the people out in the audience, if you have a mentor, hang on to them and cherish them, because they're not going to be around forever.
Well, being a Mr. Drummer, I also had great respect for Tony. There wouldn't have been a Mr. Drummer if not for Tony. But I think, when I think of a mentor, my mentor was kind of nuts. Actually, he's batshit crazy.
Is it Mark?
No. No, it's a guy named Dirk Daner. Oh, yeah, now y'all like, yeah, he is batshit crazy. You know? But when I was young and growing up, I met Dirk accidentally walking down the street. I was with Shan Carr, and we were lost in LA, and I saw a man in leather, and I went over and I said, "We're lost, we're supposed to MC an event, can you tell us where it is?" So Dirk took us to the event, and he said to me, "When you're done, come see me at the Tom of Finland booth." I still didn't know who he was. So Shan and I did the event. I went over to the Tom of Finland booth, and I said, "I'm here to see Dirk." And they all looked at me and went, "What do you want with him? Who are you?" I had no idea Dirk was Tom of Finland. He was the one running Tom of Finland. And so he took me under his wings, and he started teaching me pretty much everything I needed to know about being a sexual being. I would go to the Tom of Finland house in LA, and if you've never been there, please go. I would go to the Tom of Finland house, and Tom's room was upstairs. And there were his sheets were on the bed, his uniforms are hanging there, and his sketchbooks are open and sitting on the table. So I would be up in his room looking through his sketchbooks, and then I go to bed and I feel like, oh no, it's haunted in here, I can't stay in this room, you know? But Dirk always held me close to him, and he still does. And he's still batshit crazy, and he's always been batshit crazy. But he's a person who loved me and showed me that it's okay to be a sexual being. I was also growing up in San Francisco, and there were a group of men called the Leather Daddies. And they all ran for the title, and they would stand at the Eagle on the stage behind the, there was a post there, a banner there, and they would all just stand there looking out. And I answered to them growing up. I did anything they said to do because I saw them as my leather daddy, as my protector. And there were probably about 3 or 4 of us who saw them that way. And we did not get along, and we still don't get along, but we would never do anything to embarrass those leather daddies. One of them, Philip Turner, used to always say to me, "Don't you dare embarrass me out in public." You know, and I didn't. So I had that group of men looking out for me as I was growing up.
You know, I gotta thank you for, in San Francisco, there's an organization called the San Francisco Leathermen's Discussion Group, and it was on the verge of folding, and somebody called me and said it's on the verge of folding, and I said, oh no. And so I and a friend sort of took over the reins. Anyway, one of the first things that we did was that big program, it was like the first year anyway, called Is Leather Dead? And remember, that was this huge, there were like 400 people that came to it, and it was a big discussion, and everybody was arguing about everything. And people were saying, there's no mentors anymore, there's no mentoring anymore, I want to learn how to. And you stood up at that meeting and said, mentoring is not a service. It's not instruction, it's a relationship. And that was like the most perceptive thing about mentoring I'd ever heard. And then we started our own mentoring program as a result of that. And you know, I think it's important to remember, to know that a mentor does not have to be a lifelong attachment. I mean, I think that man back there has been a mentor to me, Mufasa. I got him to come to San Francisco for the Leathermen's Discussion Group. And I just had I knew that he was somebody important, and that Onyx was doing something big, and all the other clubs, a lot of other clubs were dying and withering, and Onyx was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And why was that happening? And why did our efforts to make more diversity in the leather community never seem to amount to anything? And he came along with Rod, who's not here right now, I guess, Daddy Rod, and explained to us very patiently and with the greatest possible cheer why our efforts had not worked and why theirs did. And I will always be grateful to you for that, because I get it now.
What about questions from the audience?
Yeah.
I mean, we're up here talking, just revisiting.
We could babble all day.
Right. So let's
We
ask
just have.
you guys to ask questions.
It's a funny. How long did it take you to learn what a SACE was?
What a what?
S-A-S-E.
Well, I was a writer, so I knew pretty early.
It took me forever.
Self-addressed stamped envelope.
And then fucking ads at the back of the magazine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I worked for Brush Creek Media, which back in the day, I did say
You
that.
did it again. One of his favorite phrases.
We had a group of magazines. One was International Leatherman. Mock was one of them.
Love that magazine.
Bear,
Bear
was
one.
another one.
That was the one I
And
got.
they all had those ads in the back, and you really did have to mail something off and hope you get it. In the meantime, you weren't interested in that person anymore. So, you know, it was very difficult to meet that way.
It was.
But we had the bars. And so I understand that people in other parts of the country didn't have that opportunity. But for me, I could walk into the Powerhouse, or there was another bar called My Place, and get laid at any point that I wanted to. So, you know.
Slut.
And one thing about the bars, just because it ties into a lot of the mythology, I was maybe my 3rd or 4th time in the Gold Coast, a very famous leather bar in Chicago. And I was sort of functioning as a top, and this guy walks up and says, "Oh, you're hot and this and that and blah, blah, blah." And I said, "Oh, but," and somebody had said something about the keys on the left meant he was top, right? And I said, "But," he goes, "Oh, fuck that." And he just moved his keys. So all this stuff you hear about this rigidity of roles, not so much.
Y'all talked about mentorees officially or unofficially in the relationship of dealing with a mentor. One of the things I noticed, I'm just a little younger, maybe not much, but the relationship between generations, that I would figuratively sit at the feet of some of the people that I looked up to and listen to them and soak in what they would say. And they would very often spend time and very cautiously or interestingly answer my questions. I don't see that intergeneration reaction as much as it used to be.
Yeah, I think, and you know, I'll touch upon some of it. I think the internet has bridged that gap a lot, that people can find out a lot more about a lot more people. So I think in some of your communities you still have the one-on-one, but you know, it's easier for you to be here in Atlanta and find a mentor anywhere else to communicate with. So in that sense, you know, the internet, and I don't always agree with it because I think it's actually hurt the community more than it's helped, in my opinion. You know, I think the internet has hurt our ability to communicate one-on-one, but I think the reason why a lot of that's not going on is because of the internet. So,
Well, I think. Oh,
Okay,
go ahead.
no,
Patrick.
you go first. No, you go.
go ahead.
Back in the day, you could have gone.
Back in, you know, we're missing a generation, and we all know that. It's kind of the elephant in the room. We all know that we're missing a generation. So the generation that would have been under me, you know, the next one down the line, that generation that we would have passed what we know to, wasn't there. But what's there are the kids who came after that one, and they are of age now. And they didn't have us to teach them anything, so we don't see ourselves in them. We see ourselves in the men who taught us, the men and women who taught us, but we don't see ourselves in the kids. And so in a way we sort of mourn that. We want to be the ones to say, we taught you how to do this. You're throwing these great dungeon parties. Well, I had something to do with that. But we don't. They've taken it and they've run and they're doing things their own way. We have boys in San Francisco who throw the best dungeon parties, and we didn't even tell them how to do it. And so, and it's a little bit scary, it's a little bit off-putting. And they say to us, just come to the party. You don't have to do anything. You didn't have to teach us. This is how we're doing it, and you're invited. And we go to their parties now, and we don't have to do a thing. So, so you know, although I wish we had had that group under us, I'm so glad that the kids now have just sort of taken the bull by the horns, and they are running shit, and I'm going to let them do it.
But I mean, what Ray said earlier, though, I mean, when we were all self-taught,
Pretty much.
and we relied upon ourselves to learn, and I think the younger generations are doing that too.
I want to say that when I maybe gave short shrift to those guys that I knew in New Orleans because nobody ever asked me to kneel at their feet. They never made me feel like I was dumb. I didn't know anything. They thought I had something special. They thought I was bringing something new and hot to the party. And that's how I've always tried to treat guys who are newer or younger coming in. You know, you could tell that in LDG I wanted to install people with their passions. Yeah, what do you got? What do you want to show us? What do you want to do? And let them do it. I mean, and screw it up if they need to, just like I did.
There's 2 points. Number one, anybody who's we've all grown up, we've all been teenagers, we've all rebelled against the parents, we've all wanted to grow our hair, cut our hair, wear bell bottoms, not wear bell bottoms, listen to rock music, listen to punk music, everybody wants to make their generation kind of unique and make their mark. Why do we think kink and leather and BDSM and fetish are any different? So when a young person comes along and has a very different look and sense of their kink, whatever that might be, I think that it's really totally natural that they don't look like me, they don't play necessarily like me, they don't have roles just like me, they don't have a culture just like mine, and that's okay. One of the things that I think we sometimes try to do is pass it on as though it is supposed to be a carbon copy thing, generation to generation to generation. We're not that many generations into this leather thing. So that's all I'll say for that.
Do I regret giving all this stuff to the community? No, I would do it again in a heartbeat because now I have my own time.
I have two regrets. One is all the guys I collared who offered themselves to me in that way, that really dedicated, almost religious way that some submissive people can do, and just give you everything. I'm not saying I abused them, but I was not bringing everything to the table that they were. And I know that now. I didn't know it then. I thought I was putting up a good game, but it was a game. It was like me needing this particular kind of satisfaction and not appreciating that it meant more to them than it did to me. I feel shitty about that still. I wish I could apologize to each one of those men. And the other regret I have is that when I moved to San Francisco, I had a partner who happened to be African American. And this was in 1983 or 4. And, well, I think we first landed there in 83. And the state of race relations being what it was at the time, we were fine when we were by ourselves at home or whatever. But all we had to do was go out, see his family, or go to the Castro. And this other thing came up. This other way of people had of looking at us, talking to us. And we kind of let each other go without really challenging that, trying to figure out what it was about. I'm sure ours, it's not unique that that happens in relationships to people. Social forces that are negative and feel unconquerable conquer you. And I let that happen, and I wish I didn't. I wish I had not.
If I do have a regret, and that's that I gave a shit what other people thought. And I gave too much of a shit what other people thought. And I bought into my own press. And I bought into my own arrogance, especially in the beginning. And especially when one comes out as a dom, and I was young and cute once upon a time. And I was a gymnast and a dancer, and I had a body. And I used it, and not always in the best of ways. And at the same time, I didn't always treat people well because of that, and I copped to that. I also shortchanged myself because I didn't let myself explore a lot of the things that I should have. It took me over 2 decades to come out as a switch. I've always been a switch in here. When I jerked off, I was a switch. Not in practice, because I bought into that whole thing that, well, what are they going to think of me if I switch as a dom? I'm this well-known dom. I regret that. And I also regret the arrogance I had as a dom in my youth, because I do think I treated some people pretty shitty because I could get away with it. So, yeah.
So those women are still making us bleed.
Yes.
Yes?
Somebody had a question?
Yeah, over here. I'm a gay woman that came out in the leather bars and all the gay bars in Atlanta back in the 80s. And I don't recall there ever being a discussion about guilt anywhere.
About what? Guilt?
Guilt, honesty, integrity, loyalty.
Right.
Nobody sat me down and said, this is the way it is. But when I came back out into the leather community, with all these new people, they're obsessed with guilt. They want to find the first reference to it on the internet. They want to find the first whoever uttered it the first time. They want to find all this stuff. I don't remember being obsessed with it back then. We were just having a good time.
I've never even heard of it.
lived it, we didn't have to.
I'd never heard of it.
I've never heard of
I
it.
thought you said we'd never heard anybody give a program on guilt. And I thought,
Yeah,
Which could also apply,
But you recall ever
I've heard that
going to
program.
grand talks about guilt?
I
go ahead.
No, I two things I remember about the early days of leather culture, in my case, gay male leather culture, was we were not very obsessed with roles and hierarchy very much. And we really only operated under the basic rule of human decency, and that's treat each other pretty well. And I actually have a problem with us constantly parroting the integrity and this, all these things that we say our culture's about. That's what humanity's about.
Yeah.
Decent human beings treat each other decently. Men and women respect each other. People of different, ethnicities and backgrounds respect each other. And the newcomer versus the experienced, they respect each other. But it was just organic. It's just what we did. And if somebody didn't do that, they were blackballed.
There you go.
They were, and in gay male leather culture, the leather bar bartender was God. And they would say, never play with that asshole. Ever. Don't ever go home with that person because they treat people badly, they'll hurt you, whatever it might be. It was just about treating each other and watching out for each other. But no, I've never heard anything formal like that at all.
I haven't either. And the only thing that I remember that was sort of like that was the whole safe, sane, and consensual thing that we were doing in the early 90s. And I think, that was really just so that people weren't crazy or playing on drugs or whatever. It was just really a reminder. And after a while, the whole safe, sane, consensual thing started going away. And I was talking to, can we say Tony DeBlas anymore tonight? I was talking to Tony DeBlas. And I wanted to play with him because there was something that he did that I felt was unique, and I wanted him to do that to me. And so in negotiating this, he said, if you realize if you play with me, you're giving away all consent. So you are consenting to give away your consent. And that's the only way I'm going to play. And that was the first time I had heard that. And it made perfect sense to me. If I was going to play with the man, then I wanted him in control. I wanted him to know where to take me and what to do to me. I didn't want to say green and yellow and red and all that. I wanted to be on that trip. I wouldn't recommend that for everyone, but, there was a different way of looking at it. So when we come up with these sayings like, HILP, which I've never heard of either, or the safe, sane, consensual, there's also another part to it. And we're leather people, we want a little bit of danger. We want a little bit of risk. That's part of the excitement and the fun of it all.
But also safe, sane, consensual, if you look at a lot of the history of it, it was used actually to justify our actions to the vanilla crowds, that we could say, we do everything safe, sane, and consensual, and they'd buy into it. Well, fuck that.
It was a political statement.
Yeah, it was a
It
political
was done at
statement.
the time of Dworkin and McKinnon and the Women Against Pornography and
March on Washington.
And there was all that thing where you could take where pornography, even gay male pornography, especially leather pornography, was anti-woman and could be taken to court and they could challenge. So it was important to
Right.
say consensual,
Right.
safe, sane. And they did kind of get people off our backs for a little while, until we got on our own backs.
I don't ever remember in the first couple of decades really of playing even the concept of a safe word.
Right.
People would say, you know, just yelp or moan or say something or just talk to me and or, you know, can you grunt? Yeah, because a gag was in, sure. Okay, that's it was very informal. It wasn't very formal. And most of the time it was just say, I'll know. You know, we've talked about it. We'll know. And to this day, I don't play with safe words. I don't either. I have occasionally played with safe signals with people that are going to be gagged that I don't know very well in a public dungeon I haven't met before or something like that. It's very rare. I just say talk to me or grunt or say howdy do or whatever. It almost turned me off to have it. It took the edge away from the scene for me, so I didn't.
I don't play with safe words.
So it's honor, integrity, what?
Loyalty and trust.
Oh, loyalty, okay.
Those are human values.
Right.
Yeah.
We should all treat each other that way.
Read Miss Manners, it'll go over the entire book with you.
Yeah, this
You know,
matters.
just to take the opposite point of view,
Gene Autry's Cowboy Code.
I think it is important for us to talk about, maybe not in those words, but I don't know that people appreciate enough that when you do a scene with somebody, their life is in your hands. I mean, something could go wrong. And that person needs to understand something could go wrong and my life is in his hands. And you need to understand if something goes wrong, I own it. It's mine. I did it. I won't deny it. I will honor it. I will take care of it. That kind of leather education, I think, is not stale. I think we still need that.
I agree.
Right here.
I also had never heard of the hilt thing, but in a lot of people's definitions of what is leather, those words come up a lot. So I would like to ask you guys how you define what the leather lifestyle, what differentiates that from BDSM?
Oh, I think they're very different. I think there are a lot of BDSMers who aren't leather folk at all. I think it's morphed over time, and I think leather has become a culture, but it's a subset of the larger kink community. And I think to equate leather and BDSM and leather and kink and leather and fetish or whatever is incorrect. I think there is a leather culture, but it's a subset, and I think we hold it up on an altar as kind of like the thing. If you're kinky and you're part of your leather, I don't even use the word for it. If I didn't write a column and have to write about it, I would always use the word kink.
Right.
Always.
You know,
unless I was referring to a specific aspect of the culture.
I mean, the umbrella should now be kink, not leather. We've evolved. It's no longer, I mean, leather has become a subset of kink, not the other way around.
Yeah.
So we go to these leather events. They're not leather events, they're kink events. You know, we've evolved. Things changed.
They're neoprene events, some of them.
I don't.
They are. It's more neoprene at some of these things than leather. I mean, and the other thing is that the reason I have an issue sometimes with using leather a lot is that when I talk to younger people coming into the scene, they literally interpret it as this. Well, I don't have leather, so I can't come to your party. I don't have leather, I can't walk into that bar. I can't, you know, and you have to go through this whole explanation. No, it's an umbrella term and it means this or whatever we define it. And they say, well, why don't you just say something else? And so I respect it because it is a culture.
Well, you know, looking at that when I was younger, I did wear the same thing that everyone else wore because that's what I saw. So I wore the leather vest, some Levi's or leather pants, some boots, because that's what we were wearing. Now that I'm older, I have on rubber Keds because they were easier to put on. I have on rubberized jeans because they still fit. So, you know, as you get older, what you're wearing tends to be what you can wear at the time. And even going into a dungeon now, if I'm going into a dungeon, I don't want my boy all dressed up in leather because that's just more work I have to do in getting him out of that. You know, you have to plan that in a scene and all that. So now it's just wear a jock strap, wear something and take your clothes off and just have on a jock strap so I have access. I don't want, you know, all this leather stuff. I don't want a harness. I don't want any of it.
Plus, it's past my bedtime.
Yeah, you know, and we get older, we get tired, and we want the easiest scene possible. Can I tell a race? I have to tell a race. Race once told me that when he can do a scene and have the guy show up all ready to go with, and you're probably just making it up.
No, it's true.
He already has his shackles and cuffs on. He has restraints on his legs, and he just comes in and Race just hooks him up, and he's ready.
It's true. It's true. I used to actually give restraints to some of my play partners and say, show up, pre-cuffed, whatever. I want to go click, 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 and start. And you're talking to somebody who used to do like 3-hour mummifications. I don't do that anymore. I just want direct access. Anyway.
To the question about the kink versus the leather, what we've been approached about by people in the kink community is our organization. How more organized we have been with the history of our clubs, and that the dungeons, when they have paid members, don't want to volunteer to do anything. And where most of our organizations have been volunteer organizations that you pay a membership to belong to, that we come with the heart of service or of doing things for the community, and even cleaning the dungeon if we've had a party and we've done that, and that they can't get people to do anything. And so they've been looking to us to teach them or to help them with some kind of purpose for not just play, because then the dungeons are going under because there's people who are paying the money but they're not doing anything to keep the organization or join the board. They can't get board members to serve on the board. They just want to come and show up and pay the money to play, and they don't have the organization to keep the thing running. So that's what we've been approached with in the last few years about, well, how do you do it? How do you keep it together? How do you keep the organization together? How do you make the thing run?
That, to me, is the difference between, BDSM to me is a collection, aggregation of practices. You know, there's piercing, there's fisting, there's bondage, but leather is a social structure. It has social connections, it has a history, it's different.
Yeah, it's community.
There was a question over here. I'm sorry. She's been raising her hand and lowering her hand.
I have all the time in the world as long as you do. First of all, thank you on behalf of everybody.